Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of A View from Earth, the official podcast of Fisk Planetarium right here at the University of Colorado in Boulder. As always, my name is Tara. I'm a planetary scientist and a CU alum, also the presenter at the planetarium, outreach coordinator, other fun stuff like that. And I am joined by Colin. Hi, Colin.
Hey, Tara. Yes, I'm Colin, as always. I'm an undergrad at CU studying astrophysics and computer science. And along with co-hosting this podcast, I give presentations at the planetarium. So that's me.
Sure enough. And our producer, John, is hiding in the background. Hi, John.
Hello.
So today we have a super fun conversation with Dr. Chun Yu, who works at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And in particular, he creates programs for their planetarium. So he does a lot of visualization and creating movies and shows and things. And he's also helped work on their brand new space exhibit. They just refreshed everything and did like a whole new thing, which sounds really cool. Sadly, we haven't been able to go over there yet, but eventually they'll open back up and we can go experience this new Space Odyssey exhibit. But it was super fun to talk to another museum planetarium person who loves to communicate science and has actually done education research and studied how people learn through museums and I guess what they call informal learning, we've been told.
Yeah, that was a terminology that I hadn't really been exposed to, at least not a lot, was this formal versus informal education. And I think that's kind of a good point to keep in mind, especially for people like us at the planetarium, you know, to remember that not most, because we do work with a lot of the college students and K-12 groups, but for the general audiences, you know, these people this is their science education, you know, that's it. And so how can we make that A, stick the most, but B, be the most valuable to them?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the crux of our whole job.
Yeah.
I mean, presenting right. And, you know, even with the podcast or the online programs that we do, it's all about, you know, trying to get people to connect with this sort of material. I mean, right. I don't like just screaming into the void about something I'm excited about. I want other people to get excited about it too.
That's the best part.
I know, right? That's one thing I miss the most about actually doing the live shows. You know, doing it online is fun and all, but I can't like turn off the light pollution and show people 1,000 million stars and they go, oh, it's not the same when it's just on your computer screen. Yeah, man, I miss that.
Well, you know, I was curious, Tara, as far as getting excited about things at shows and museums and stuff. When he brought up the crater simulator where you shoot the little metal balls into the sand, I thought of you. I was like, man, I bet Tara would have a ball with that thing.
I've totally used that thing. Yep. when that was still in there. One time I did go to the museum and play with it. Actually, a friend of mine got married at the planetarium at DMNS, and then we had the whole exhibit to ourselves for like 2 hours. So yeah, we ran around and played. It was just a whole bunch of astronomy majors and grad students running around playing with all the science toys.
That is fantastic.
You're never too old to play with sciencey things like that. It's still fun, always.
Except for that space shuttle docking procedure. That there's a time in life when you need to cut your losses and walk away from that table, because
but even I don't know about still.
You two. It was so hard. To this day I cannot get that thing to dock. So
it's one of those that it's fun up until a point.
Yeah, right.
And then
right.
it's a thing.
Yeah, it's a nice challenge, and then it becomes the challenge. So
you know, though, I think that's a great analogy for science in general. At least the way the way that I have experienced science and research, it's really fun at first, and then you get to a point where it's just like, I have to finish this, or or something bad is going to happen.
Yep. Yeah, you're knee deep, and you gotta get through.
Yep.
So, but you know, always remember, there's something fantastic at the other end of that, you know.
Exactly.
So there's kind of this like everyone has to earn their spot in the list of high profile researchers. So
right. It may not be something too exciting when you're just like docking in a Lego spaceship, the reward, the payoff is maybe not quite as great as,
Right,
you know,
right,
getting a PhD or a
right,
Nobel Prize or something.
right,
You're not getting a
right.
Nobel Prize for docking a Lego spaceship.
Well, hey, what do you say we jump into our interview and hear about some science outreach and planetarium programming with
I think that
Dr.
sounds great.
Chun Yu. Great. And now we're joined by Dr. Chun Yu from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, who is a part of a team tasked with creating planetarium software to visualize the known universe. He has produced movies and live presentations, including Earth Systems programs for the Digital Dome, and continued to create new planetarium visualizations and other educational content. He has conducted educational research to study the use of digital planetariums for astronomy education, and his astronomical research is in observational star formation, looking at outflows from protostars and studying the properties of young stellar clusters. Chun Yu has been involved in observing programs with the Hubble Space Telescope, as well as ground-based optical, infrared, and radio observatories around the world. He also received his PhD right here at CU Boulder. Dr. Chun Yu, thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to be on your show. This is really exciting.
So we'll jump off with kind of a big question. How did you move from astronomical research to production and visualization? Is this something that you were doing before working with DMNS?
No, actually, it wasn't anything that I was doing before. And so I think that's kind of the interesting thing about getting a PhD, because especially in science PhDs, you're basically a problem solver. You are trying to do research, gain knowledge about the universe, something that no one else has looked at, or they haven't quite used the same tools, or perhaps you're using completely new tools that people have never used before. You're creating your own tools. And so, people who end up getting a PhD are excellent at figuring out ways to come up with solutions to problems that hadn't existed before. And so after I got my degree, almost actually more than 20 years ago now, I did a short postdoc, but then this opportunity came up at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And back at that time, there were there were very few digital planetariums. This was a relatively new technology. And so the Denver Museum wanted to convert its facility, similar to what Fisk has done several years ago. And back then, a lot of the software tools that are now available from multiple vendors just did not exist. And so the institution decided to basically create its own software, and which was pretty revolutionary at the time. But during that time, the models that they were looking at were flight simulator software. These were really precursors to a lot of the virtual reality technology that has evolved since then. And actually, it evolved from kind of the second wave of virtual reality from the 1990s. And we were working with a company called Silicon Graphics, SGI, which subsequently has gone out of business. But we were planning to write software code using their APIs based on OpenGL, but using their libraries of OpenGL, their preferred libraries. And so I was hired to basically be the astronomer, to make sure that if you're building a universe, that the universe is accurate. And so, and obviously what we did was we started from the Earth and the solar system and started moving on out from that. And I was trained as an astrophysicist. As you said, I had done star formation research. And for those of you at CU Boulder, all of my programming experience was with IDL, which I'm guessing a lot of students still use. But IDL is very different from more traditional programming languages. But I had enough knowledge to sort of figure how to build a universe. I knew what references and papers and other archive information, where to look that sort of thing up. And that's how I got going. And we opened the Digital Gates Planetarium in the summer of 2003. And our first program was a 25-minute movie that was actually created from the tools that we had written. So our software was called Cosmic Atlas, and it allowed us to fly around the solar system. And we had even created a kind of a production portion of that software. So for those of you who've done computer animation, you might be familiar with tools like Maya or Lightwave, and you can basically create flight paths or camera paths using splines, and so we basically were incorporating those into our production tool so that we can control and manipulate camera paths, which actually most planetarium programs, as far as I can tell, don't really even do that. And so we were really pushing the bleeding edge back then. So it was pretty exciting.
Oh, so one of the things that I wanted to ask about from, people who also work at a planetarium, what do you think are some of the most challenging topics to convey in a planetarium setting? Or maybe conversely, what do you think are some of the more effective topics that are made for a planetarium?
Yeah. Well, I think, the planetarium is a really interesting space in the sense that it's not a traditional classroom. I mean, you have this giant curved dome overhead or in front of you. And so that can make it challenging. And then of course, different planetariums have different seating layouts. At Fisk, you have concentric seating where around the central star projector. And at the Gates Planetarium, we used to have that before the conversion to digital, but then they decided to completely remove that type of floor plan and excavate down into the floor so that we now have stadium style seating. So what you'd find at movie theaters where everyone is pointed in the same direction, and and all the seats are sort of tiered, so you'd have to walk down steps to get to each row. And so what that allows you to do is to have kind of a same visual point of interest for the entire audience. Everyone is looking in the same direction, and you're also flying forward, whereas in a concentric dome, the only common point of reference is in the center. So different layouts and different configurations make it really challenging. And so if you want to show traditional material, like, I think most professors use PowerPoint slides, now you have to figure out, well, how do you put that rectangular image onto the dome so that everyone can see it? And sometimes you have to use different tricks. You might try and find a common viewpoint for the audience, or sometimes, in shows, you have multiple versions of that same picture, and you just put them around in different locations so that those same pictures are visible to everyone. But I think what I like about planetariums is the fact that if you kind of break out of your mindset of what has to be a traditional classroom, you can use the strengths of that space. And so you alluded to some of the educational research that I did, and we used college students as our experimental subjects. And so we had college classes come into our dome, students from the Metropolitan State University of Denver. And what we found is that you can use the space of this immersive visualization display environment to mimic, obviously what everyone is trying to do is we're trying to mimic or simulate something that is difficult to simulate, the real world. But here you can simulate the night sky around us. And what you can do is, when you're trying to learn a lot of basic astronomical topics, the seasons, or you're dealing with phenomena that are very difficult to learn just because you have to break out of this kind of earthbound mindset. And that's the mindset that people have grown up understanding. But now you're dealing with phenomena that are three-dimensional, that are at different scales. And so to understand seasons and to understand celestial motions, you have to understand that you're sitting on a ball that's spinning, and that ball is also moving through space around other celestial bodies. And you have to be able to understand all of these relationships and to understand how your viewpoint meshes with everything that's happening. And so it turns out that it's sometimes easier to see that in an immersive environment like a dome or some kind of VR virtual reality type setting than it is if you are staring at a textbook two-dimensional image, because in a picture or a slide, a diagram, you're collapsing all that three-dimensional information into a 2D analog, and that can make it really confusing or very challenging for many people to understand. Whereas if you see something all around you, you certainly understand, you're looking at the sun, you immediately grasp how high the sun is above the horizon, what the rough altitude is, and you can understand things rising and setting, and you immediately see that all around you, as opposed to trying to interpret a two-dimensional, scale down diagram version of that. So I think that's where the power of domes really come in.
Colin, are you back with us?
Yes, I am. I am so sorry. My apartment power went out, and it has since come back, but the internet is still out. So I'm calling in. So sorry if my quality is not as good here. So, man, what an interesting curveball. So moving forward, I'm curious, how is designing and producing content for planetariums and dome shows specifically different from designing a museum exhibit? Is there a sort of psychology with people, with how people interact with these different mediums?
I actually think a lot of it's very similar, and I think there's more of a dichotomy or more of a difference when you look at trying to look at the difference between informal versus formal education. So formal education is what we all grew up with, going through K through 12, and then finally, 4 years of college, which I think most of your audience is in the middle of. Whereas informal means education that doesn't take place in a formal classroom. And so, when people talk about informal, they immediately think their mind jumps to museums and planetariums. But if you think about informal learning, it actually goes way beyond that. It goes to watching science documentaries. I mean, if we just keep to the topic of STEM education, science, technology, education, and math, it can go into watching videos on YouTube. It can go to astronomy clubs. You can learn science from gardening groups. You can learn science at national parks and at nature reserves and at zoos and aquariums. And so informal learning is actually this vast network and web of things that people do outside of school. And people, there's been dedicated research on how people learn in informal environments for many decades. And I think most museums and people who take their informal education really seriously, they understand that what we do in the informal sphere is very different than what you do in the formal classroom or at a school or at a university. And that's just because when you're going to college, you go to a class regularly 2 to 3 times a week. You meet for several hours each week, and so you have this repeated exposure to that material, and that's how you really learn. And whereas in an informal environment, you might have a single exposure that lasts 10 minutes, or it might last an hour at most. for talks or presentations, or if you go see a dome program. And if people have actually tracked people in museum settings, and the minimum dwell time for an exhibit or for a particular location at an exhibit, we're standing and looking at one particular thing, can be on the order of 1 minute. So, so the amount of time that people spend at exhibits, at museum exhibits, or in any sort of these informal programs can be extraordinarily short. And so museums and other informal education institutions realize that, in that very short amount of time that people are exposed, there isn't the ability for us to convey the kind of content knowledge that we would expect in a formal setting. And so our job, is definitely not to get the information wrong. We don't want to convey wrong science, but instead of making sure that this information is drilled into people's heads, I think the goal is more to get people excited about science, that there is this vast scientific world out there that they can learn more about. And by pumping up their interest and excitement, perhaps we can motivate them to go learn more by themselves. And there's actually a lot of indirect evidence that this approach works, as well as growing direct evidence from research studies. So John Dierking and John Falk and Ling Durking, just switched their names, two huge researchers in informal education. In 2010, they wrote an article for the American Scientist called the 95% Solution. And they point out that if you added up all of your formal school training that the average American undergoes today, so that's 12 years of K through 12 education plus 4 years of college, that only amounts to 5% of your total waking hours of your entire life. And then if you think about how much science learning actually takes place, that's even smaller, because most of the time people aren't learning about science, and the amount of science that's required keeps dropping as you go through education. And then obviously, many of you have probably heard about how terrible American students do compare to their peers internationally when you compare them on standardized tests. When you look at their math scores or their science scores on tests like PISA and other tools to to gauge how much students know. And that's true, and that's something that educators and policymakers have been fighting with for many decades, trying to figure out how to make our students be just as good as our competitors overseas. But the other point that people often don't realize is that if you actually start polling adults, so not students, but adults, and you look at, and you can't poll adults on, the same way that you poll or you test students, but you can poll them on science literacy. And it turns out that American adults are just as good, if not better, than most adults in other similar type of societies in OECD countries, for instance. And so what that means is that, even though there is this huge education gap early on, somehow, we make it up with the adults later on in life. And there are a lot of indirect and as well as more direct evidence that a lot of that has to do with informal education, that people go to museums more in the US, or they're involved in STEM type informal science, or what they call lifelong learning opportunities in the US more so than in a lot of other countries. And so this accounts for the fact that we still manage to have a somewhat science literate, semi-science literate populace, despite all these problems early on.
And in a similar kind of vein, like DMNS and here at Fisk, we always we'll do like an hour show with a movie and then a presentation with an actual person coming and standing up. But that's not the case at a lot of planetariums, which I was surprised to see. Do you think having that human element to it is important, or is it good enough to just let them watch a 30-minute movie and then take that as they will?
Yeah, I think the human element is super critical. And unfortunately, part of the reason why the human element went away often has to do with finances with budgets. And so it doesn't have to do usually at all, unless the people running the place are seriously misinformed. It doesn't have to do with the fact that they don't want to put a human presenter in front of the audience. Oftentimes it's unfortunately because they need to there are costs associated with hiring people. And when we reopened in 2003, I said earlier that we went from concentric seats that are in a circle around the central star projector to a unidirectional seating where everyone everyone is facing the same direction, like you find in a movie theater. But what happens when you do that is you chop down the number of seats, because with concentric seats, you can have seats in rings that go all the way out to the edge of the dome, and you can squeeze in a lot more chairs that way. And of course, those seats are pretty terrible because you can see in front of you great, but if you try to look at something above you, you get really terrible neck pain if you spend a lot of time doing that. But what happened was we almost effectively halved the number of seats in the theater from about 200 to 120 or 118 is the current seat count. And so it was a sort of an executive decision by the higher ups at the museum to go initially, with this half-hour movie model without any presenters, because you could have a much quicker turnaround of the audience and basically try and keep up the revenue stream. Whereas if you had an hour-long presentation or an hour-long turnaround with a presenter, now you're adding on costs. But since then we've have slowly evolved to as budgets improve and as people figure out finances, we have managed to put together live programming that do involve presenters, but most of our programs, for a long time had been all movies. And then with the pandemic, we've again switched to all movies just because we don't want to have people speaking, even if they're mic'd, into an audience. So what has happened over the last year has seriously changed how things are done in museums.
So you were part of a team recently that redesigned the Space Odyssey exhibit at DMNS. What brought on this new decision to completely redesign the space section rather than just updating or adding new exhibits?
Well, I think the main decision point, I was actually not on the main, I was not on the main core team for that, but I was brought on to help with a couple of the exhibits. And so there was a PhD planetary scientist who was on that team, and he had been involved, Steve Lee, who recently retired. He's also had a long association with LASP at CU. I think the main issue was that the exhibit, when they started first looking at this, the exhibit was over 15 years old. It opened in 2003, the same time that the planetarium opened. I mean, we basically opened both at the same time, and they were building the planetarium and creating this new space science exhibit simultaneously in parallel. But it was pretty old, and during that entire time, the exhibit had never been completely static. There had always been improvements to it. And one of the things that was actually very revolutionary with the Space Odyssey exhibit when it opened was the idea that you would incorporate the human element into pretty much most aspects of it, so that we had a core volunteers who would be interacting with the public. So, normally if you go into many museums, science museums around the world, not only in this country, I mean, there might be security guards, or you might have one or two docents who might be there to explain, an exhibit. But for the most part, you often don't end up interacting with anyone at all. But here, there was a conscious decision to incorporate live people who would be there to explain, and the exhibit was designed also to bring in current news as well, so that we would often have it would be showing launches or landings or various events related to planetary science or human spaceflight, and all those would be facilitated. And we also have a science on the sphere that was added about 10 years ago, just like you have one at Fisk. And of course, it's also really easy to update data sets for the science on the sphere. And it's and you can run the SOS on kind of autoplay, or you can create a kiosk for people to bring up their own data sets. But it's even more powerful to be able to explain to people what they're seeing, and to have people really invested, or volunteers are really invested in the programs that they're creating, so that they often have their own favorite data sets that they bring on to talk about Earth systems or Earth processes or things happening on other planets. So Space Odyssey was really unusual in the sense that we incorporated this human element very early on, and that's what when it opened in 2003. Soon after that, it was actually recognized by our peers as being this very innovative type of space. But what we also learned was that having something super innovative, not only in the human element, but also in having interactives that people are playing with. We had a crater interactive where people could shoot marbles into basically a sandy surface to recreate how craters are formed from impacts. We had a shuttle docking type of interactive, where we had space shuttles floating on an airtable that people could try to navigate. But what turned out, what would happen with some of these cool interactives is that they often broke down. They're often really difficult to maintain, and sometimes during some months they were offline more often than they were online. And so over time, and then during all that time, we also were continually adding to the exhibit and slowly improving it. So Science on the Sphere wasn't in the original exhibit when it opened. It appeared almost a decade later. And I think what the powers that be realized was that at a certain point, there's only so much that you could do to improve things by making fixes here and there, and that at a certain point that they had to go with a complete refresh. And so that's what they did.
I remember that space shuttle docking activity, and I was terrible at it. I could never get it to work.
I would get so frustrated with that thing. I would spend too much time at that table, and then I had to walk away.
Yeah, and then of course, I mean, now nobody even knows what a space shuttle is if you're in elementary school, because they haven't flown since before some of these kids were alive, and so that obviously is something that had to be updated. So time marches on.
It does indeed. Well, in that same sort of vein, as knowledge and information and things are becoming increasingly accessible through the internet, and people are getting more familiar with like VR and AR, virtual reality, augmented reality. Do you think that the focus or maybe the role of museums and planetariums is changing or adapting, or has it already started to change?
Yeah, I think museums have always been forced to adapt and change as, well, I mean, I think, that's not quite right. I mean, for a long time, many museums are very static, but as society has, as the pace of change in society has quickened, especially, in the last 10, 20 years, and people can say, back in my day, things were different. You often hear that, but I think museums have been forced to change, and especially with museums being forced to close with the pandemic, since we're kind of coming up on the first 1-year anniversary of society basically shutting down, and everyone trying to figure out how they can continue their operations, with not being able to have people be able to meet in your building or to come to you. And at DMNS, we've basically switched over to virtual programming so that, and we actually reopened last summer to 25% capacity. So, we got a variance from the city of Denver to reopen, and we have been extremely safe in making sure that that audiences or visitors coming in or follow all safety protocols, and the institution itself has set up all sorts of guidelines and things that the staff have to do. So I've only been in the building just a handful of times, just because there are limits to the number of people that can be in the building, and since I work on a computer, I don't have to go in. And so going to online programming is one thing that everyone, not just museums, but schools, businesses, I mean, everyone has switched to. But there obviously, you mentioned virtual reality and augmented reality, and there are all these tools that are coming up that can basically mimic the types of things that used to be unique to universities or planetariums or museums. And so I think the heart of your question is, how do we adapt to the influx of these new technologies that at first glance might make our jobs go away or be less useful to the public. And my response to that is, again, going back to the human element and the fact that at museums and at universities, we have this expertise that is difficult to replicate. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's difficult to replicate in an app or on a website. And one of the programs that I've been involved with at the museum is something that we call Digital Earth, and it's using planetarium visualization technologies to, instead of focusing out on space, we turn our gaze back to our home planet and to talk about our home planet and to get people to understand that how the Earth system functions, and various issues with it, including climate change and sustainability and general global environmental change. And I had actually done some visitor research of our audiences, and because I was wondering, flying over the surface of the planet while zooming into high resolution tile sets of the surface is basically what people do when you look at Google Earth or Google Maps. So why would people pay money to drive to the museum to come for an hour to see something that they could experience at home? What we got from the audience surveys weren't surprising, but they can be very enlightening in the sense that they always pointed back to our presenters, the fact that they were super knowledgeable. And so if they even after having gone through one of our presentations, they could still go back home and fly to the same locations on Google Earth, but it's just not the same because you aren't hearing the same stories, you're not understanding the same context about what you're seeing. And so, most people, if they ever play with Google Earth, they'll zoom down to their house or to their school or their place of work. And then that's kind of about it. And that's a tiny, tiny fraction of what you can see over the entire surface of the globe. And so having someone who can hold your hand and navigate you to all these different places that you've never gone, but they can tell you stories of what you're seeing, stories of themselves experiencing these locations. I mean, that is huge. And so that, I think, is really the critical difference between what museums can do and what an app can do, is that human element again.
Hooray for presenters.
That's right.
We're biased, but yeah, I love that.
So I'll go ahead and move into a segment that we do on the show called Capcom Q&A, and I'll plug it really quick for anyone listening. This is actually our last interview that we're recording of the season because we do these out of order. And for next season, though, please send in your questions. We have a whole, we're going to have a whole bunch of, I shouldn't say we don't yet, but we will have a whole list of people to talk to and ask questions to. But these are user-submitted questions, or listener, I should say. They use our website to submit the questions sometimes. And we'll go ahead and start with a question from Michael from Santa Barbara, who's asking, how does outreach vary as you shift demographics? For example, curious citizen versus entrepreneur versus politician or students.
I think that question about outreach can apply to really any type of education, because if you if you're your audience really helps determine how you frame a message and what information you give to it. And to bring it back to people who are at CU, who are taking science courses, and you might be thinking, what type of careers that might be possible if you continue in science. Obviously, there's a bias when you're interacting with professors who are research scientists, and all you know is this academic type of environment. But what I found in talking to people, especially PhD astronomers and other PhD scientists, PhD physicists, is that there's a huge number of types of activities and careers that you can have, and all of those involve you interacting with very different types of people. And again, what I said at the very beginning of this podcast, a PhD isn't, for me, oftentimes it is about this research field, but it's about learning to solve problems. And part of it is also learning how to communicate. And so there are PhD scientists who not only work at universities, but also obviously museums, but there are also PhD scientists who are in policy, that they are working in the government, helping to write white papers that are supposed to be read by members of Congress or by the executive branch. There are PhDs in the business world, and obviously, and then a lot of physics and astronomy people with those degrees now end up in the tech world working as data scientists. And so there's actually a huge variety of types of careers that you can go into, just because you've mastered, or maybe not mastered, but you have a really good ability to solve lots of different problems and to be very creative at doing that. And so in each of these different cases, you have again, a very different audience, and understanding who that audience is paramount. And understanding that audience not only means what job positions those people have, but their backgrounds. Where do they come from? What are their educational backgrounds, and what do they know coming in? And you might not know that for a specific person, but you have to know that generally, in order to be able to craft a message that is sensible, that is concise, and also has impact. And that's something that as you if you're taking science classes and you're you're in a STEM field, and you're hoping to graduate with a bachelor's or a master's, a PhD, oftentimes you're so focused on the science aspects of it, and unfortunately, this communication skills are not usually emphasized in those degree programs. But when I talk to students, it's something that I always go back to re-emphasizing, because even as a scientist, even if you do end up working in academia, you still have to communicate with your colleagues, so that you're writing papers, you're writing grant proposals, you're giving talks at colloquia and at academic meetings. And during all those different types of presentations, you have to connect and reach your audience. And if you fail to do that, then you're not going to convince your peers of the value of your research, or you're not going to be able to convince them to give you money to fund you to continue doing your research. So understanding your audience and knowing how to communicate is vitally important.
Absolutely. So our next question is from Macintosh from Denver, who wants to know, do you have any preferred methods for constructively countering the rise in misinformation in today's society?
Yeah, that's something that I think anyone who's serious about science education has to grapple with if they haven't been thinking about it and been worried about it. And today, I mean, who would have thought a year ago that public health officials, people or doctors who are trying to communicate basic information that can save your life would be vilified, or their lives would be threatened, or their children would be threatened, or their information would be doxed. And so I think there's long been a misconception that if we only present our audiences with the right information, that people would just absorb it like a sponge, and that would be all you would need to make sense, make a topic sensible to the public. But for people who've been following, the debates, and we can so-called call them debates on evolution, or anti-vax, or and climate change deniers have been around for a long time, but there's definitely been more of an urgency in recent years, and I think what we have to realize as science communicators is that people are not tabula rasa, these blank slates that they come into our classroom and we fill their brains with information, and then they leave. But they come in with their own backgrounds, with their own interests, and they've had a lifetime up to their their current point in life of information that they've received from the environment around them, and that can be the news media, that can be the social media posts that they interact with, they can be their family members, it can be the church that they go to, and other social groups and networks. And so all of these affect how we process information. And this is something that social scientists, psychologists, sociologists have known for decades. And I think it's only slowly being understood by the physical scientists, but it's the physical scientists who really need to understand this, that how we present to the public and how we convey our message, getting people to understand or to change their minds can be extraordinarily difficult because of what people bring with them. And a lot of this also has to do with identity. And so if you're trying to get people to even do something as simple as recycling, and depending on the community that the person lives in, you might be making all these arguments about what good it does to society and how helpful it is. But if no one else in their community recycles, and if recycling is viewed as being bad by everyone else for whatever reason, I mean, it could be there could be a political reason, there could be some weird reason that we haven't thought of, but it's very hard to change someone's conception of a topic if their identity, if their social identity means that they have to be against that particular idea. So you might make a really good argument for recycling or something else, or not using plastic straws, but if they have to go back to their family or to their coworkers or to their church and suddenly meet resistance from everyone else around them against this idea, well, whatever education that you're trying to do is not going to help much against this immense amount of social pressure and identity. So we basically have to come up with smarter ways of doing our education, especially with topics that can be construed as controversial by different groups.
A much lighter question now from Emma in Boulder. How does one get a job at a science museum?
Yeah, I've actually been asked that quite a bit, and it's not easy, unfortunately. And that's just because there aren't that many science museum jobs. If you think about science museums, I mean, you might have, one major science museum in a metro area. Denver has one. I mean, there are children's museums that you might find more of, but the Denver Museum is really the major science museum for the entire state of Colorado. There might be smaller science centers. Fort Collins has one. You can think of Fisk as being like a science center, but there aren't that many of them, and most museums are nonprofits, and so that means they are seriously constrained by the number of people that they can hire. And oftentimes in budgets, personnel costs are usually one of the biggest parts of any budget, whether you're talking about nonprofits or businesses or government entities. And so it's, the number of jobs total can really restrict how easy it is to get a job at a place like a museum. But there are still a lot of things that you can do in order to make yourselves look good to a museum when a position does open. One is to look for opportunities to volunteer. So one of the, as I mentioned earlier, Space Odyssey is very different from other museums because it was designed to have volunteer docents, lots of them. Typically we have, I think, like 300 when we had people regularly coming in pre-COVID, and they were broken down into 14 shifts each week. So you had a morning shift and an afternoon shift. So that's a lot of people. But we didn't, that program didn't come up. It didn't spring out of empty air. It was actually a part of a long-term volunteer program that the Denver Museum has been nurturing and building for decades. And so I think we typically, before COVID, we had on the order about 1,900 volunteers working at the museum, and they do pretty much everything that you can imagine. So not only are there people counting visitors, taking tickets, interacting with visitors, but there are volunteers who work in various research labs, paleontology volunteers, or cleaning fossils, and they are actually also active in helping to write research papers because they've learned so much and are so deeply involved with the research. There are volunteers working in different administrative types of positions throughout the institution. And so we in Denver are lucky enough, but are also very unique just because we probably do have the largest volunteer contingent in the world, because most museums elsewhere in the world don't have volunteers at all. And so there are opportunities to volunteer. I mean, not so much now, just because I'm still figuring how the museum will reopen in coming months. I mean, reopen even more so than it has. And part of that problem is we have to restrict currently the number of people that can be in there. And so that means currently we still don't have volunteers out on the floor. But even despite that, if you can't get an opportunity to volunteer at us because we're not taking volunteers right now, or it's hard for you to drive all the way to Denver multiple times a month, you can also try and figure out ways to do science communication on your own. In the past, again, things have changed with COVID, but I encourage people to look at libraries, to look at other institutions that are around them, and to see if there's a way for them to insert themselves to create some kind of program that that you can interact and engage with the public. Because a big thing about informal education, it comes down to, again, communication, being able to communicate with the public, being able to communicate with audiences at all ages. And if you've taken enough science classes, you often know that your science professor is usually the last person you want talking to a school group. I mean, sometimes not. I mean, some of them are master communicators, but oftentimes people who spent their entire time in academia, have trouble communicating their science to the public, just because your brain isn't really trained for that. And but the more you do it, the better you get at it. And now, the fact that YouTube and Instagram and Facebook, I mean, there's just so many more ways for science communicators to get their messages out there. And even podcasts. Podcasts 15 years ago were a relatively new thing. But if you look at podcasts, video podcasts on YouTube, there are YouTube channels that are science-based that some of their videos get millions of views, and I mean that's huge. I mean that's much, and right now I'm not sure of any single group that has tried to catalog the impact of science YouTube videos, but it must be absolutely enormous. And so there's just so many different avenues for passionate educators who want to communicate science to the public. There's so many ways for you to get involved. It really comes down to your imagination and your passion and how much you want to get that information out there.
Excellent. So our next question made me laugh at first, but I think it does really speak to a lot about change and adaptation. So Tron from Austin wants to know, was it soul crushing to remove Pluto from all the displays in 2006, and is the pain still felt today?
I don't think we had a display of all the planets, and in the original Space Odyssey, there was a Pluto picture that was up on the wall. So the definition of planethood wasn't something that we focused on in our original Space Odyssey exhibit. So that picture of Pluto was a Hubble Space Telescope image. So so I think that was the one from Mark Bowie's paper. So it's this super low res, very blocky, pixelated image of Pluto. So that wasn't really an issue, but I think Pluto is definitely a question that gets asked because lots of kids are still invested in Pluto because Pluto is definitely the underdog of the planets. And usually when I'm asked, I like to just introduce the topic of how different Pluto and the other Kuiper Belt objects are compared to the rest of the planets. That if you look at the solar system, there's a clear break in different classes of planets, from the terrestrial planets to the gas giants to these ice balls that are out in the outer solar system. And so understanding why these worlds are so different from one another goes back to trying to explain the history of the solar system and how the planets in our solar system evolved over time. And again, if you only have 1 minute with a group of kids, at most you can describe how the planets are very different from each other, or even orbitally. Pluto's orbit is very different from the other planets' orbits, and so you can try to describe these differences without even having to go into the controversy, because as you probably know, there's still plenty of controversy between planetary scientists and some planetary scientists like Alan Stern and some of the astronomers who were at the forefront of trying to demote Pluto at the IAU. So unless you have a lot of time to dive into that, which I usually don't, I don't try to go into the controversies, but to just talk about the differences and to get people to understand that there's a lot of really interesting science that can be learned just by trying to explain how our solar system evolved.
Excellent. And I think with that, we are at our time, our hour for the episode. So Dr. Chun Yu, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Actually, it's still the morning. I lied. It's this morning. Thanks for joining us this morning to tell us all about your work with the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Colin and Tara. And it's great fun to talk about what I do, and hopefully, your audience will get some cool nuggets of information to help inspire them and motivate them to learn more themselves.
We hope
Absolutely.
so too.
And that concludes our episode today with Dr. Chun Yu. We'd like to thank him again for giving us his time and talking about his work with DMNS, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Remember to check back in next week for a conversation with Dr. Amanda Hendricks about ocean worlds. Ocean worlds being worlds that are oceans away from Earth, right? Think about Europa. And hey, listen, Tara, that's not always an obvious thing. You know, she's laughing at me right now for those of you that aren't watching the video. Anywho, hey, go ahead and check out our website at www.colorado.edu/FISC. There's a whole bunch of fun things you can do there. You can see our episode schedule for the rest of this season. You can check out episodes from previous seasons. You can submit questions for us to pass on to our experts. And you heard a pretty serious plug from me about that earlier in the episode, but please do. It's a great thing. It's very exciting to see questions from listeners. And of course, you can donate. We really appreciate any financial support from listeners like you to our podcast to help keep it running, and so we can produce more episodes and give you more interviews to listen to with Colorado scientists, educators, and the like. Let's think. Well, where's our podcast available? It's available at Spotify, SoundCloud, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. And I think that about wraps things up. So, hey, we'll see you next week, and thanks for listening.